Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar entitled Stop Identity Attacks in Their Tracks, a Roadmap to Risk Reduction. We're specifically going to be focused around the risks and then how to solve for them when it comes to really protecting not only your organization, but the identities that really manage it. My name is Stacy Ladwinger. I'm the VP of Marketing here at SecureWorks, and I'm really excited to have with me Chris Yule. He's the Director of Threat Research with our Counter Threat Unit, or CTU as we like to say, along with Ryan Albin, who's our Director of Global Pre-Sales Strategy and Operations. We'll have both of them join us back in a minute. But with that, first I want to do some housekeeping. If you're having any technical difficulties, please let us know in the help widget. If you have questions throughout the sessions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We will respond directly, and if we don't, we will get back to you after the session. At the end and around here, you'll see a variety of related content. Please go ahead and download and leverage. Please share out with your teams. And then at the very end, you're going to get a survey. So if you have any feedback, please share. And then finally, we're always asked, will we get a copy of the slides? Will there be a recording? Yes, we'll send that out after the event today. So before we jump in the topic, I always like to do a quick introduction for those that don't know SecureWorks. And who are we? We help organizations around the globe protect themselves against cyber attacks, ransomware, and other forms of potential threats. With that, we help organizations see more, detect better, and respond faster, regardless of size. We truly help organizations scale out their security programs to help them secure their mission. And that brings us today, what are we talking about? We're talking about identities. When you think about identities, and Chris is going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that, we say it's really the fuel of the cyber criminal ecosystem. Why? Because once a threat actor gets access to an identity, they can start moving throughout your environment. We see that they're often one of the top ways that they get in, and if they don't get in that way, they quickly look for ways to access your identities. Because of this, we've also seen why organizations can get breached so easily. In working with our customer base, we've seen that over 95% of organizations have some critical misconfiguration around their identities. One of the things that Chris will go into is because of this, we've also seen 688% increase in stolen credentials on the dark web this past year around the marketplace, actually the last 3 years. We've also seen that 90% of organizations have experienced an identity breach in the last year. That means at some level an identity has been exposed or shared or taken. And because of that, 79% of those breaches has resulted in lost data. And as a reminder, the average cost is around 4.5 million. I share this not because we want to scare anyone, but really make awareness of the way to improve your risk posture as an organization is to protect those identities and understand where issues might arise. And so why have traditional systems fallen short? Identity is not a new discipline, it's not a new area, but let me give you an idea of where the gap really fits for a lot of the organizations we work with. Most organizations at this point has an identity and access management strategy, even a team. What they're really focused on, though, is ensuring that the business operates efficiently and securely as possible. This means that they're making sure users or systems get provisioned to the right access levels as soon as they start or new systems come online, making sure that organizations remove those and kind of have lifecycle management around them. Also ensuring ways like zero trust and single sign-on to make it more efficient for the business to really make sure employees and users have access to the things they need, but no more than that. This is a well-known discipline. Now, on the other side, you have your security operations team. They might be in your SOC. They're on the far spectrum where they're really focused on how do we react when threats do happen around identities. So they're monitoring the systems, but they're detecting threats, they're investigating, they're responding, they're recovering, but they really don't have any purview on how things are being organized, where the potential threats and risk might lie. These two teams often have worked independently. We've actually seen where IM has moved more into IT versus even security. And this has really led a gap in visibility and understanding the risks around identity and how to proactively address and fill those gaps. That's where there's a new discipline that really has been starting to form, bringing these teams together. And that's around identity detection and response. The goal of identity detection and response, or IDR, is to help organizations understand their overall posture help them prevent identity attacks, and then to detect and respond as quickly as possible. If you look at any of the analysts out there, many are talking about the rise of IDR. Gartner specifically calls out the rise because they've seen that there's been an insufficient way to protect these identity systems because of this lack of visibility. And so what SecureWorks has introduced to help organizations solve these problems, and we're going to talk a little bit later on today, is a solution called Taegis IDR. But before we talk about how Taegis IDR really helps you prevent, detect, and respond to identity threats, we thought it'd be really important for Chris, who's coming from our counter threat unit, to talk about the real world threat behavior he's seeing every day as he works with organizations across the globe. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. Hi, everybody. Yeah, as Stacey said, my name is Chris Ewell, Director of Threat Research in the CTU. And one thing I wanted to talk about today is my team's job is making sure that we understand the threat landscape and the threats facing our customers. And SecureWorks is extremely threat focused in designing our services and how to protect customers. And so when we were coming up with what are the next focus areas for us, what are the next services we want to look at, we really wanted to make sure that we were focusing on the things that were a real threat to our customers. So I want to talk a little bit about why we see identity as the next big thing in terms of threat monitoring. So when we think about identity, it's really been crucial and a crucial part of any network intrusion. And what is it that threat actors are interested in when they're trying to get access to your environment? Well, at the most basic level, they're interested in user accounts. So can they obtain credentials, usernames, and passwords to gain access to your environment? So we still see some malware-based threats, but we see a lot of incident response engagements, a lot of cyber attacks affecting our customers where stolen credentials are the way into the network. Once they're in the network, they're really focused on privilege escalation. So they may have a standard user account. What they really want is a domain administrator account, anything that has more permissions that allow them to do more of the things and access more of the systems that they're really trying to get access to. And as we move into a more complex cloud environment over the last few years, we're seeing increasingly complex, opaque cloud environments that provide lots of opportunities for threat actors to exploit. So can they find misconfigurations, permissions that aren't quite correct, trust in cloud environments? Can they abuse that to obtain their actions and objectives? So that really gave us three areas of focus on a new identity service. So can we find stolen credentials available on the dark web, for example? Can we identify user and service accounts within the IAM environment with excessive or unusual permissions that maybe lead to cyber attacks that we've seen in the past? And can we also look at misconfigurations, trust, to identify any unusual or problematic application permissions that on their own might not be too problematic, but when we combine those with threat actors and different user accounts, that may provide opportunities for them to exploit. I'm going to talk about each of these. So if we look at stolen credentials, there's really a huge burgeoning market for usernames and passwords for corporate systems emerging in the dark web. So when we first looked at June 2022, so the Russian Market Underground Forum is one of the leading marketplaces for threat actors to sell stolen credentials. In 2022, we could see just under 3 million usernames and passwords for sale on the market. And this is the eBay of stolen credentials. You can browse, you can try and find credentials for companies that you're interested in, and you can choose the ones that you want at the price that you like. In June 2023, that had massively increased to over 7 million credentials for sale. And each of these bubbles represents a different info stealer. So an info stealer is a type of malware that runs for a few seconds on a victim's machine, stealing as many things as possible and sending it to a server. So that'll be typically usernames and passwords from browsers, any credit card details, things like that. We've seen a peak this year. So in February this year, we saw just under 10 million credentials available for sale. So as you can see, a huge growth in the market, and there's a lot of churn in this market. So people are buying these, people are using these, and they're priced accordingly. So if they can see a username or password that is for an admin account, they will go for significantly more money than a standard user account. If we look at a typical case study of a ransomware attack, so this example I'm about to talk about is a ransomware example from last year. This is a US company. This unfolded initially when a threat actor logged in to an admin account via remote desktop. So we don't know exactly how they got these credentials, but it's a reasonable assumption that either they bought those credentials on the dark web or they had previously done a phishing attack to get some credentials. In this case, the remote desktop was not provisioned with multi-factor authentication, so they were able to log in with a single username and password. And then they did what most threat actors do in network intrusions. So they start doing network reconnaissance. They're running tools to identify what systems they might access. And then they run a tool called Mimikatz. So Mimikatz is one of the most common tools that we see deployed in network intrusions. And Mimikatz's sole purpose is to try and obtain more credentials, more usernames and passwords from the memory of the systems that they're in, with the ultimate objective of obtaining domain admin privilege. So in this case, we see the threat actor deploy Mimikatz, and then on a second system, they're able to obtain privileged credentials. We then see them start to move laterally through the network using remote desktop with the privileged accounts that they've obtained with Mimikatz. They then execute Mimikatz on a second system, eventually obtain a domain admin credential. And then 2 hours later, they've been in the environment for around 12 hours. We see them use that domain admin credential to deploy ransomware, deploy a bunch of batch scripts, and encrypt 146 systems. And the first that the victim knows about this is Monday morning, 9 a.m., when users report being unable to access the development environment. This is typical of many network intrusions, whether that's ransomware or intellectual property theft, where a single user account can be the initial access vector, and they're immediately trying to escalate the privileges and find as many user accounts with privileges that they can use to ultimately obtain their objectives. If we look at a second case study, this was an example from around 18 months ago. This was one of the most sophisticated uses of opaque cloud environments that we've seen. This was an example of where we've moved from Microsoft maybe asking for usernames and passwords to log in cloud environments requesting permissions for applications. So they're not necessarily looking for the username and password, but what they're trying to do is trick a user into granting permissions for an application to use their username to do nefarious things. And there's a really interesting example I'm about to talk about. In this case, the actor was attributed to a Chinese state-sponsored threat, and initial access was they'd compromised an admin account in the victim's Entra ID environment. Now, at the time, it was an Azure AD environment. We're now calling it Entra ID, so you'll hear that term used interchangeably. What they did was they used that admin account to create a brand new user account. So really trying to not use the admin account too much, so that when they're doing their day-to-day activities to try and steal intellectual property, they're using a user account with normal-looking privileges. What was interesting about this was that they applied a permission to this user called application impersonation. This permission gives the user the ability to impersonate any other user in the environment when using applications. Now, there may be legitimate reasons for user accounts to have this, particularly for service accounts. But in this case, this was a standard user account that had this permission that had you been using a service like ITDR, would have looked particularly unusual. They then also used the admin account to register a custom-made single-tenant application within the Entra ID environment. So this was an application that they had made specifically for this victim. And this application was given a separate permission called all required resource access for Exchange web server. What that permission allows is the application to access the Exchange mailbox of the user that's logged into the application. So again, on its own, this permission is possibly useful in certain application environments. But what the threat actor could then do is, now they had all these components in place, is over a period of days and weeks, log on to the user account that they'd created, use the application impersonation privilege to impersonate any other user in the environment. And then when they had done the impersonation, log on to the single tenant application and use that to access, read, and download the mailbox of that user. So ultimately, by logging onto a single user account, they could access and download the mailbox for anybody in that customer's environment, in that victim's environment. Now, this is a really good example of where permissions that on their own are powerful and useful, when combined in certain ways, can be really destructive in an environment if a threat actor gets hold of them. And as I say, this is one of the most sophisticated incidents of this type that we've seen. These types of incidents aren't common, but they are what we believe we're going to see more and more of as time goes on, as more threat actors start to understand the way that systems like Entra ID can be configured to obtain their objectives. So we really wanted to design IDR as a way to make sure that we could help customers detect these kinds of conditions and unusual combinations of permissions to prevent these attacks before they happen. So to sum up for me, identities and privilege are key targets for threat actors. The move to opaque cloud environments makes managing those privileges significantly harder, and that provides lots of opportunities for threat actors to exploit. With Taegis IDR, we want to really augment our detection of malicious activity that we already have with XDR, with the ability to find the conditions that allow threat actors to be successful within IAM systems. So with that, I'll hand back to Stacey to move into the demo.
Thank you, Chris. And I think the example you just walked through is a great one around you can't just set and forget your identities and your privilege. You have to have constant purview of what's happening. Do you see any of that suspicious behavior? Because it's not always kind of that scan and grab. They're definitely coming in and sitting and seeing what other privileges they can get. So appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as Chris talked about, these are the things that we see day in and day out that we've observed with organizations. And because of that, one of the things that we really wanted to help is give organizations a holistic approach to really reducing the risk that comes with identity and privileged access. And it addresses a lot of the things that Chris just spoke about. First, how can we help organizations really reduce that identity attack surface so that they can find misconfigurations very quickly, identify where potential risks lie, where suspicious behavior has occurred, and make sure that those can be addressed before a breach even happens. The other one is exposing where on the dark web are there potential stolen credentials. The fact that we can go out and look at the dark web and share back with organizations that they can really minimize their risk. They can go back to those users and make sure they're changing passwords. They can see if any of their senior level executives may have things on risk, also helping protect anyone that is leveraging these out there on that dark web. The other one then is to really identify those risky user behavior. And so really identifying where's abnormal activity. Is someone accessing an area from an IP address that they normally wouldn't be located? Are they asking for access or rights for an application that's typically used in finance and they happen to be in engineering? There's a lot of this type of behavior that might go unnoticed if you're not looking at it holistically. And then it's really critical that if an attack does happen, able to detect that that threat actor is in the environment and respond quickly. It might be automating the removal of password rights so that you can truly protect the organization. It's that holistic view, both from the preventative and proactive, to understand your posture around identities, specifically looking at that Entra ID, which is not easy to do in the tool itself, but then also making sure that you've got the ability to respond and detect very quickly. Instead of just talking, I want to bring Ryan back, and he's actually going to give a demo around some of the tools that we can use and the way that we really apply the insights that Chris shared into an application that really helps organizations keep them safe. Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacey, and also thank you to Chris. It's a very sobering case study to see how a threat actor can exploit what would be an otherwise unseen, invisible part of a very complex Entra ID environment, and how that could leave a threat actor in your environment longer than any of us would be comfortable with. So I'm really excited to share our IDR solution with this group today. I've actually shared it out on the screen here. And I just want to give you a very quick overview, really the power of this application to take what is very complex and make it simple and give you actionable next steps that will help you materially reduce risk so you don't end up as a case study for an exotic identity-based attack. Just looking at the dashboard here, we already see the organization that we've simulated here is in a high risk state. A very simple graph that will be updated daily, that as you make changes and further configure the environment, you can reduce your risk with time and be able to socialize that with the stakeholders in your environment. We are consuming all sorts of signals from Entra ID in addition to the signals we're already gathering from the in-motion use of it. So in an XDR solution, we're already going to be bringing in authentication logs and looking for certain types of attacks. IDR is looking at some of the more static configurations to look where they may be presenting risk to your organization. Just looking down the first third here, this first column, I can already see risky users in my environment based on their in-motion use of Entra ID. So in this case, our fictitious CIO, we can see some of the common entities that she's using to access the corporate environment. We get some organizational awareness from Entra ID about who are some of the key stakeholders she might be interacting with, and can browse to other actions within this particular user profile. So again, this is a very quick way to bring that riskiness front and center and get some situational awareness to that. Moving right, we start to see some of the findings. So as we're continuously inspecting Entra ID, looking for some of these common and uncommon configurations, we're surfacing the most risky to the top of that stack. And so, for example, here we see a very high risk. An external application has local credentials. I can learn more about that particular finding here in the findings tab. And I can read about, that this is an open finding. I need to take action here. I can learn more about why this might be a risk from the product documentation for Entra ID. And then when I'm ready to take action after I've coordinated with some of my stakeholders, I can quickly pivot into the console for Azure AD, for Entra ID, implement those changes, and reduce my risk for that particular score. So these findings, very powerful to, again, to Stacy said, protect your environment by, reducing that attack surface. And then to the right, we talked about info stealers and the marketplace for stolen identities. It's really the reality of modern life now. There's so much information being disclosed on the dark web that can be used in attacks against us. We're scanning for those breached accounts from your environment, from your users. And when we do detect that one of your users was involved in a breach and they had not yet taken a remediation step, there are years worth of credentials on the dark web, and many may no longer pose a risk to your organization because your user has changed their password, or they have implemented other changes in their behavior to reduce that risk. But here I can bring up, these are findings for where we know the credential exists on the dark web and the user credential is still in a vulnerable state. So for a particular user here, we can go into that detail and again, take those actions. And actually, we can initiate the forced password reset or take those containment actions to disable or enable the user directly from the IDR console using the integrations within Taegis XDR. So it's, for me, having managed identity years and years ago before it was on Entra ID and the complexities that we saw in identities at that time, and knowing how magnified it is now on for these cloud-based systems, having a solution like this to continuously scan for these findings, surface those that are the most risky to the top, and then making it simple and actionable to take that step to reduce risk is very powerful. So this is just really a very quick demonstration of what we've brought to bear in Taegis IDR to build on what we're already observing in motion through monitoring this through the XDR solution, and something you can learn more about as coming outside of this webinar. So Stacy, really appreciate the time to be able to share these a little bit about what we've done here, and hope folks find it interesting and can learn more about it. So I'll pass the mic back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks for that demo. Not only do I think it's a very powerful solution, but one of the things that I think is really powerful is that a lot of what's been created in the solution is based on the insights that we've seen on threat actor behavior, what we're seeing through the research the counter threat unit team works on day in and day out, and building that in to this platform so that we can help organizations be more secure. And as
Absolutely.
a result, just to kind of summarize what you said, Ryan, is it's really about reducing risk. That's really what we're trying to help organizations do, recognizing that as soon as someone gets access to an identity, they can move through that environment fairly swiftly and often unnoticed. And so what you just saw was the ability to really uncover any type of risk in under 90 seconds and giving you that security posture check for your identities. A lot of organizations I've seen have spent quite a bit of money to do a point in time review, but then it's another quarter, maybe it's 3 quarters later that they do it again. This allows for that 90-second check on a regular basis. It's also looking for over 60 different types of challenges that exist with identities. This is something that we believe is much more robust because we're looking at the real life ways that threat actors get in, how they maximize those misconfigurations or challenges, and then we're making sure that we're checking for that to identify that risk level, to really identify those risky users. We're also constantly monitoring the dark web to make sure that organizations don't have their user credentials out there, especially some of those that have more privileged access. We mapped against 100% of the MITRE attacks. As you can see, we really are detecting those identity-based threats and then responding quickly, both through automation as well as playbooks that organizations can run. And then what we didn't highlight is this is fully integrated into a more robust extended detection and response solution that really can help you detect and respond to threats regardless of that initial access vector, whether it's working with your endpoints, your email, your cloud solutions. Also looking at if you have OT type systems, we're pulling that into a fully integrated view so that you can have that holistic view across all of your threat landscape. So we're really trying to help organizations prevent what they can and protect based on that posture, but then a robust solution that can detect and respond to threats. And if you don't have a security team that can do that, either us or one of our partners can offer that 24/7 service, really leveraging the power of the SOC on top. So I know we covered quite a bit today, all the way through the threat to the solutions that we have, but we did have a few questions that we haven't answered throughout. If there's others, go ahead and put them in. I also leave you with a quote. We have customers actively using this today. But one of the questions, and Ryan, I think you and I have heard this quite a bit, we got is, doesn't Entra ID settings already by default make sure that an organization is secure? How's this doing more than what's already available today?
It's a great question, and you're right. It is one that we hear commonly. I mean, the settings for these solutions are not secure by default. Secure can be different for every type of organization and what their risk profile is. And as we've said in other briefings, the trick with authentication is to find that balance of friction and enablement within your organization to protect against users logging in without getting in the way of getting business done. So for higher risk environments, you may impose more friction. Lower risk, you may reduce some of that friction. So it's a long way around to saying is, it's impossible to say what the absolute best secure defaults are for every company in every scenario. And so, Microsoft leaves it to the user to kind of figure out what those might be. I think what I find really challenging about that approach is there's so much unseen that you have to know, just like in the example that Chris showed. So short answer is it's not secure by default. Organizations need to find that balance themselves. And that's something that IDR can help when they configure.
And I think the other challenge to that, to your point, Ryan, is a lot of times identities are set up to ensure people can work seamlessly. The first thought isn't always about security and protection. It's about how can I make sure that someone has access to what they need to do their job every day. And then we often do think about the deprovisioning, but we often miss the oh yes, get that person privileged because they need to be able to do their job. And
That's right.
We just move in our workday because we're trying to be efficient.
That's right.
Chris, the next question I see, I think could go to you is, what are some of those common misconfigurations that we potentially see in identity systems that organizations should be aware? We mentioned looking for 60 different misconfigurations. Are there a few that really pop up that organizations should look at?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is, so we haven't just plucked these out of thin air. So we've been doing, well, our incident response team do readiness assessments or consulting engagements, essentially. We've been doing AD assessments for 10 years, I think. So we have hundreds of these cases where we look at organizations' AD and try and understand, are they configured properly? And like 95%, as you said earlier, we find something that's wrong. So when we say misconfigurations, that could be something like a misconfiguration. It could be something like it's not quite best practice. But generally, we're talking about things like over-permissioned users or particularly service accounts and applications and things like that. So the example that I gave where you got those combinations of unusual permissions. So really looking for things like that, which in some organizations, you might tick the box and go, yeah, we know about this, it's fine, but at least you know about it and you will monitor for changes over time. But you also have crazy permissions, like particularly in Teams. There's one example that we saw where a customer thought that a permission gave them access to the user accounts in Teams, but it actually gave them access to all of their files, which then let them use that to sort of harvest files and get sensitive data that way. Multi-factor authentication not configured properly, privileged applications that are only protected with a single client secret rather than something more complex. Those are the kinds of things that through the years of doing this that we've realized are the really crucial ones to look for.
Well, great. We are kind of out of time. So if we didn't respond to your question in chat or here in live Q&A, we will follow up via email. So please do continue to enter any of those. But if you're interested in learning more, first, if you're interested in learning about the identity detection response space, we actually have a free Gartner report that really talks about where the gap existed as I started and things to think about as an organization to make sure you're truly bringing your identity teams and your security operations teams together. I also encourage you, if you've not yet registered, we have our Global Threat Intelligence Summit that's running on October 3rd. Chris will be there presenting some of this information, but a lot more about ransomware, state-sponsored actors, and a variety of other key topics. So please register for that event. It's going to be all about the threat. And then we've got a few other assets for you where you can go ahead and learn more about Taegis ITDR. If you are interested in a free trial, we're offering a 30-day free trial where you can go in and connect to your Entra ID. It's pretty seamless, and you can automatically see where those misconfigurations exist. And we will definitely work with you to make sure that you get that full exposure and see the potential for everything we shared today. But I want to thank everyone that's joined us live. Very much appreciate it. And as always, Chris and Ryan, I enjoy doing these webinars with you. So thank you both for joining today. Hope to see everyone soon.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Stace. Take care.